Testing. Testing.
I'm tired of spending every evening with me. I get so sick of I wish I were we. I wanna do things, but I need company like he needs she. I wanna stay out late, wanna celebrate. I wanna hear that crooner groan. I want to drink champagne and raise some cane, but I don't want to do it alone. I want to hug and kiss, want to live in bliss. I want to need a chaperone. I want to bill and cool, I want a chance to woo, but I don't want to do it alone. I got a plan for two that I'm aching to share.
Okay, good afternoon. This is the February 14th Ordinance Committee meeting, and what better way to spend Valentine's Day than talking about reconstruction after a natural disaster. So, Madam Clerk, would you call the roll, please?
Councilmember Rouse?
Here.
Councilmember Hotchkiss? Here. Councilmember Murillo?
Here.
Okay, and we have 2 minutes of comment for anybody who wants to speak on an item that's not on the agenda. Madam Clerk, is there any speaker slips or nothing on for the? So we'll close public comment and we will go to the item. Would you read the item, please?
Proposed ordinance amendments to establish post-disaster regulations for historic districts. Recommendation that the Ordinance Committee review and consider staff recommendations on the preferred ordinance provisions for post-disaster alteration, repair, restoration, reconstruction, or demolition of historic resources.
Thank you. And Mr. Lamone.
Good afternoon. Before we get into the center points that we want to ask the Commission, I did want to just briefly outline our previous discussions. We were here in July of 2016 to discuss the differences between historic districts and special design districts. That was the primary focus of our discussion last time, and we outlined the existing regulations that the city has and the possible new criteria for these districts that as we move forward to drafting the ordinance. The ordinance is under development. We expect to come back next month to give you an outline of the ordinances with all these specifics. But before we do that, we also checked in with you and asked you if there should be a post-disaster regulation component of these regulations, and you did direct us to come back, and that's why we're here today. So before I begin, I do want to point out that a post-disaster contingency plan is a very important, critical tool to consider when adopting a historic preservation ordinance. There should be a reasoned approach that we should have after a natural disaster that possibly involves significant damage to our historic resources when they are possibly beyond repair. And the focus of our attention today is to try to pose some of the key questions that may be involved after this natural disaster. Part of the discussions have been involved the chief building official, Mr. Stuffler, who's here today, and trying to understand the type of timelines that are necessary in order for us to make the type of damage assessments that are necessary and the evaluations in order to move forward on some of these repairs. The outline of the staff report also indicates that the staff is recommending some key components involved with the ordinance. And the key components are primarily modeled after the CPF ordinance that is an attachment today in your staff report. That model ordinance that was formulated outlines the type of detailed analysis and steps that are necessary when these resources are damaged. And what we're suggesting today is not the full type of document that's included in the model ordinances. After discussion with our building official, he has assured us that there will be a careful analysis of these structures before they are demolished. And that's been some of the history with some other communities, that there was not that pause in effect that allowed a careful analysis of these historic structures. And unfortunately, some communities allowed them to be demolished. So what Mr. Stuffler has indicated, that using the city's post-disaster risk placard system, that even though there will be red tags possibly given that identifies them to be unsafe to occupy, it is not a demolition order, and that there will be some type of education outreach after a disaster, or maybe before, if we get it out there, so people understand what it means to be red tagged. And obviously, planning's perspective and the historic landmarks perspective is we don't want the demolition of buildings to be done in haste. Actually, the Public Resources Code, Section 5028, prohibits demolition of significant alteration of these listed historic resources unless they are designated as an imminent threat, or unless approved by the State Historic Preservation Office, or the SHPO. And so again, what we've been assured is that there's going to be this analysis made of these damaged resources to determine whether or not they are in fact an imminent threat to health and safety or an imminent hazard. There's definitions I will outline for you. The imminent threat standard is it immediate, impending, not remote, uncertain, or contingent? And then, is there a likelihood or bare possibility of injury is insufficient to constitute an imminent threat? That's the opposite, that you can't call something an imminent threat if you can't establish that threat to the public. And my understanding is it's not only the possibility that the building may collapse, but it also might affect adjacent property owners and or the public right-of-way. And so there are means to protect the resource by cordoning off the area. That's what the building official has indicated to me, as well as initiating orders to brace or shore the building. So the key issues that we would like to outline today are what happens if an historic building or structure is damaged, and what types of determinations are made. Who makes those determinations with respect to the imminent hazard, imminent threat criteria? And when it comes to demolition versus shoring and bracing, what are the timelines involved for those decisions? When we've looked at communities that have outlined these timelines, they have placed mandates on the chief building official to act within a certain amount of time, not only to ask that buildings be braced or shored, but also to begin the process for demolition to occur and what that involves. And what you'll find throughout these questions is a component involved with not only in requiring a property owner to act, but also what happens if the property owner fails to act. Does it become the city's responsibility? And I think Mr. Stuffler and Mr. Vincent might have some additional comments to you on what that would take to get those orders enacted. It might cost the city the initial cost to do it, and then I have some liens applied towards the property owner. But that's certainly something that you might want to consider as we ask these questions. I'd like to walk you through the proposed city review process, and as we walk through, I think it's appropriate to see if you have questions with respect to the questions we're asking. As you review these, we also want you to consider how they would apply to all types of resources. Would you have a different standard for let's say, a city landmark or a structure of merit that have been designated versus a property that's just been listed as a potential historic resource? We have all three. I've also handed out a list of properties that the city owns that have been identified as either designated. And so that question may come to you also. What do you do with a city facility like City Hall if it's damaged? How far damage would it take for us to consider demolition of the structure? Or would the city take its more conservative approach and say you would like this structure to be reconstructed no matter what the cost. And so those are the considerations that property owners would have to be faced with when you deal with the question of should you reconstruct and repair. So as we move forward, feel free to ask me any questions that you might have or pose it to the building official or the city attorney. So the disaster occurs.
Just one
yes.
question.
Sure.
Maybe you already said, but who is the State Historic Preservation Officer? Did you already say that and I missed it?
I think I mentioned that there is some notification process involved with that, or it's included in our staff report.
It's someone in state government?
Yes, there is an office, and they essentially are the overseeing of historic preservation programs in the state. And so there are some responsibilities to notify that office if a demolition is going to be occurring for a state-listed property.
Thank you.
So the first assessment that's done is whether the damaged structure has significant damage and that whether there's integrity still in the structure to determine whether it's safe to occupy. And that's our placard ordinance spelled out in 2209. We also have an ordinance that's an attachment in your staff report that outlines what happens with partially destroyed buildings. With discussions internally, we felt that existing chapter was not sufficient to address historic resources. And so what we would envision doing is moving forward with our own chapter dealing specifically with historic resources and how we would apply certain steps and processes to evaluate those resources. So the part of the assessment to evaluate these buildings is to go through and identify the critical public safety and critical infrastructures, which are the first priority. And historic structures we've been asked to also identify as high priority. We feel that those may be further damaged if they're not protected. So one of the conversations we've had is to make sure that those buildings are identified quickly and given priority in the sense that some of these are very visible landmarks in our city downtown structure, and anything we can do to help brace them and protect them from further damage, we'd like to have hopefully occur. Now, one of the dynamics that Mr. Stufflick can also speak to is that depending on the extent of the disaster, there may be some assistance required from other agencies, and how quickly they can go out and inspect buildings would be a consideration of why we may not mandate, let's say, a 5-day requirement. Within 5 days, buildings must be posted and shored. We certainly would like to see some type of certainty with respect to that, but it's just a question of resources and how quickly they can respond and go out and inspect these buildings. So the primary question is, does a damaged building pose an imminent threat, and could it possibly damage the adjacent property? So one of the key questions is, who makes the determination? The building official, civil or structural engineer. We would like a civil or structural engineer involved with that assessment. That's one of our recommendations. And I believe it's very important also to advise the Historic Landmarks Commission that a building will be demolished. And I think they're going to take that assessment from an engineer more credible if you have some supporting analysis that says this is why this building is unsafe. And so I think there is an agreement that that's what we would like to have included in the ordinances. And one of the questions with respect to imminent threat is, do we preclude the public from the area around the structure when there's a proposed imminent threat, and what type of notification is required? Do we restrict the occupancy? So that is some of the questions that the building official will discuss with the fire chief as how to provide adequate levels of safety for the public. Here's the Public Resources Code, again, giving the authority of the city to take steps to protect the public. Oh, I'm sorry. It's my son. So the first question that we would like to ask the Ordinance Committee is, should the city require property owner to shore up or stabilize a damaged historic resource before processing a permit for its demolition or alteration? And if yes, what qualifications are required? So if you'd like to discuss that as one of the first questions, I think it would be probably more prudent to just try to get through these questions one by one.
So you'd like to do that now as opposed to at the end of the
I think
presentation?
so. I think that we'd like to record where you're at with respect to that question.
Okay, the committee? Mr. Hotchkiss.
If we had a disaster that involved a number of buildings, as you pointed out, there are resources available to assess how serious the damages are limited, at least at the city level, and maybe in the private sector also. So, all this in this slide, should the city require a property owner to shore up or stabilize, etc., and the need to have a civil engineer, I guess it was, as well as a contractor, architect, etc. I mean, this is a lengthy process. It's not going to happen, overnight. It's going to be a month or two anyway, correct, for each building?
Well, I'll answer part of the question. I'll let Mr. Suffolk continue. That I think there are two questions that are posed. Can there be some immediate type of shoring or bracing that could happen to help prevent additional damage? And then that whole safety assessment that comes later. I'll let Mr. Suffolk talk about that.
And immediate that's going to take pretty careful examination also.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I want to say Councilmember Hotchkiss, Committee Member Hotchkiss. The process that we use is to do what's called a rapid assessment first. It's a one-page, 8.5 by 11, usually done by a building inspector. If they see that a building is damaged significantly, they will ask for a detailed assessment, which is done by an engineer. That detailed assessment can come days, weeks later. It depends when we can have that resource available to us. Fortunately, we have quite a good cadre of professional engineers in Santa Barbara. So we don't have to do it from within our office. We can use the resources that are in the community. And we do certifications for those people. At least annually we offer them. So we have a capacity. The problem arises when we have a large earthquake, we have a lot of damaged buildings, and we continue to have aftershocks. Your assessments, kind of get washed away with every aftershock that's significant, right? Because now you have to go back and start over because it may have been made worse. So it's very difficult to try to estimate what's our capacity, and that's why we would recommend having latitude, a broad latitude in the number of days that we have to do the work we need to do, understanding the intent is to do it as rapidly as possible.
And can that latitude you're talking about, can it be flexible? Because as you say, we have no idea the extent of possible damage.
Yes, it can. We can set the date instead of like a 5-day time frame. We can say a 30-day time frame. The understanding is that we're going to try and get them done as soon as possible. What we're trying to do is define a parameter that kind of puts the city in a position to not ignore it and not let it just linger, but to address it.
So,
Mr. Hotchkiss, I also want to mention to you that some communities also put a time frame on when the work has to be completed as another way to accomplish it. So you could issue an order to do it and say it needs to be done within 30 days.
yeah, I can say putting that on paper, but when it meets reality, who knows? I mean, it could be completely unrealistic.
Mr. Chair.
I know maybe we're going too much in the weeds
Mr.
here.
Vinson.
No, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I would say that you're not going into the weeds. We want you to go into the weeds in this discussion. I would frame the circumstance a little differently than Mr. Lamone has. The initial assessment done by the building official and whoever is assisting the building official, that will occur as quickly and as thoroughly as possible. The duties and obligations of the building official and the city in general to protect public safety require that assessment, that initial assessment, looking at the buildings, determining and making a decision, it looks like this is unsafe for occupancy, this has limited occupancy, or this building is okay. That assessment needs to happen as quickly as possible, and I would not recommend that with this particular ordinance set any timeline for it. It's going to happen as quickly as possible. Where I would recommend the committee thinking about timelines, and it does factor into what Committee Member Hotchkiss was getting at, is the next step. You've now had that assessment from the building official. The building official has said that this building is dangerous. You can't occupy it.
Right.
That sets in motion for the property owner a quandary. That's either their home or it's their commercial property that they now cannot charge rent on.
Right.
They're going to be wanting to do something about that. This ordinance that we're talking about today is about putting a pause in that process where the property owner may be interested in moving as quickly as possible to demolition and moving on with their life with respect to that piece of property. And that the community is saying, wait a minute, this particular piece of property has historical significance to the community. It's been identified either as a landmark, as a structure of merit, or maybe it's on our potentials list. And we have a special interest in that piece of property. So even though the property owner may want to move quickly towards demolition and move on to the next phase of this property's life, the community has a separate interest. So that's the frame of mind that I'd like the committee to be thinking about when we're talking about timelines, talking about expenditure of resources in the sense of a property owner who wants to keep the building, shoring it up in an interim fashion, they're going to be doing that anyway. They need to do that anyway so it doesn't have further damage. If they want to rebuild and restore that resource, they're going to be shoring it up on their own. They're going to have that interest. However, if that property owner isn't quite sure that they want to rebuild, they don't know what the cost is yet, they may want to go towards the demolition route. In that case, the community is going to have an interest in having the building shored up so that imminent threat is removed, but at the same time, giving both the property owner and the community at large an opportunity to spend more time thinking about, in a more measured fashion, should this building be restored, rebuilt, or is it so far gone that it's either unreasonable to expect the property owner to rebuild it, or it's just so far gone it can't be rebuilt with its historical integrity intact. So that's the frame reference that I'd like the committee to be thinking as Mr. Lamone's asking his questions. It's a matter of timing on the part of let's taking a pause as opposed to rushing towards a demolition, and then a balancing act on what resources is the community going to be expecting a property owner who may be unwilling to expend those resources absent this ordinance in order to buy that time for the community and the property owner to carefully think about whether it's appropriate or necessary to demolish the resource.
So if I can continue here, so does the decision above and beyond the pause remain in the hands of the property owner or in the hands of the city?
This ordinance would ultimately, the property owner would have to come to a body, and so far the recommendation would be the Historic Landmarks Commission, and present their case for the demolition of the property. And that probably, and this factors into where some of our questions today are, what kind of evidence should that property owner have to present in order to make their case to the Historic Landmarks Commission? Is it sufficient that their contractor comes and says, yep, this building looks bad, or is it going to be a building official? Does it require a structural engineer? Would it require a structural engineer with specific experience in historic buildings? Those are that's the flavor of the conversation today. Is I think they're going to need to come with some evidence to explain, if the building is so far bad that it is truly a threat and there's no other way to protect the public or adjacent property, then I think that process will be rather streamlined. It will move to a demolition sooner rather than later. It's going to be the closer calls where the property probably can be rebuilt, but it might be more expensive than that property owner is willing to expend. And so then
than the property's worth.
Or that the property is worth. I mean, again, you're talking about historic resources. And so in some cases, our historic resources may be more valuable to the community than what they could garner in a rent revenue. Some of our adobes are not large structures. They don't present a modern type of building use. However, they are an important fabric an important part of the historical fabric of parts of the city. So the economics doesn't always, it's not always going to necessarily turn on the economics of the decision making, and this ordinance would bring in those other factors.
So should we keep going in this? Because there are a couple of other questions
I'd
here.
love to pass this back to Mr. Lamone, and
whoever
I'll
wants
jump
to
in.
answer the question is fine, but let's say the property owner reaches the determination there's no way to continue forward to rebuild, and the city says, nope, you got to rebuild. Can he just walk away? Seems to me he can.
But there will be a point in time where there's a balancing of the two. There is a point in time, there is a point along the continuum where this ordinance will create a dividing line. If it shows that the resources necessary to rebuild are vastly beyond what is reasonable, and there will be an opportunity in this ordinance for ultimately the city council to make its own determination where that dividing line is. Is it 50% of the market value of the structure? Is it 75%? Right now, I don't think we're ready to make those dividing lines.
Let me cut to the chase here if I could. Let's say there's a disagreement. The city says no, you got to keep it, and the guy says I can't afford to. It's not worth it. What's his choice? His choice is he's going to abandon the property. Correct?
The property owner,
he can't be forced to rebuild this if it's not within his either desire or ability.
At some point, there would be other tools available to the community. At the end,
such as repurchasing or whatever.
Yeah, the city could at some point, if a property owner wasn't taking the action,
right,
the city could take the action itself. It could, if it did take the action to protect the property, at least in an interim fashion, we could recover those costs through a lien. If it was to go so far as to that the city was going to restore the property and maintain it going forward, that literally there was an abandonment, then I would see that there would be some kind of condemnation process, and the city would then become the owner of the property.
Is that built into this ordinance?
We have not built that into this ordinance at this point, but that would be a potential end of the process where a property owner walks away. The thing is that property owner, you can't get rid of title until you give it to somebody else. And so it may be a point where the property owner is reluctant and unwilling and simply will not take the actions required of them.
Or cannot, yes.
Or cannot. But you don't get out from underneath that property until you dispose of it to somebody else. So,
well, I think we need to look at the worst case prognosis, and if we write that way, it'll never happen. But if we don't, it will. It's kind of the philosophical way I'd say it. All right, thank you.
Ms. Murillo.
Thank you. Mr. Lamone, can I counter your suggestion that we go question by question? Would you go through all the slides?
Sure.
And then there's some experts that I really admire in the audience, and I sure would love to hear what they have to say.
Yeah, I was just going to
They're
suggest
familiar with who owns these kinds of properties. Are they generally people who care, or maybe they inherit and they don't care? I don't know. There's so much.
That's fine, Councilman Murillo, as long as you promise that we return back and try
point by point.
No,
point
we'll get back, but I think Ms. Murillo's right. We have
That's
some
fine.
we have
That
some
we can hear
resources in the
public
audience that
comment.
we
Sure.
do want to use.
So
and
let
hear
me
from.
quickly go through these questions, and we'll open public comment after that. This next question is: should the city ordinance authorize the city to shore up and stabilize a building, even if the owner is unwilling to do so? That's what Mr. Hotchkiss was mentioning. Should the city conduct the work or contract out the work? And what are the costs and obligations of the property owner where we recover it through a lien on the property? 9, should the ordinance require the property owner to explore alternatives to demolition, consistent with the duty to maintain historic resources that are currently found in Chapter 22? The Model Historic Preservation Code suggests all reasonable steps to repair, restore, reconstruct the historic resource. And what I wanted to mention there is that there is a basis currently to focus on structural merits in historic landmarks for maintenance and repairs on those. And you could also mandate a higher standard for just those and not necessarily the potentialist properties. And 10, what information should an owner submit for an application to demolish or significantly alter a historic resource damaged by disaster? We could ask for submittal requirements involving photos, damage assessment reports, and experience required for historic resources required, because that's, again, a very technical matter. There are some more experienced in dealing with this issue than others. The safety assessment, and continuing on, plans and cost estimates for preservation. Some of the definitions in the model ordinance talk about severe economic hardship. We can establish those criteria working with the building official. And plans and cost estimates for these alterations or repairs through some contractor estimates. And 10, what information should an owner also include, including a plan that is not preservation sensitive? Should the property owner be required to submit a second opinion from a professional? So if there's a disagreement there, should we ask for a second opinion? Should a check-in with the council be required to explain all demolition decisions and review of all demolition orders of historic resources? And 13, should the ordinance authorize fee waivers to encourage repair and restoration that is preservation and sensitive, as one way to allow people to come in and get quick answers and not worry about fees? And potential penalties, that's something that should be considered, because there may be violations, and there should be some financial penalties so people don't go on and demolish the building without a permit. And some communities have prohibition on development or redevelopment. Some have used 5 years. If you demolish a building without permit, you may not develop within 5 years, as an example. So those are the questions.
All right, very good. Well, there's clearly a lot to ponder for this committee. We could spend quite a bit of time fleshing out each of these questions. What I'd really like to do with the indulgence of the committee is go right to our public speakers and see what their input is on this, because I'd like to, first of all, thank Mary Louise Days and Ray Hawthorne for coming, as well as Bill Lavoie. You guys are very valuable to this process. So, Mary Louise, would you please come up and address? You have a big bad 2 minutes.
And Mr. Vincent, on page 3, item 2, and in other places in the proposal, it mentions structural engineer and the building official. I really strongly suggest that you include preservation architect or other consultant with great experience in historic structures and building codes. Under item 3B, I feel that the Historic Landmarks Commission is not mentioned here. It's not referred to except broadly under the city process. I think your documents have to specifically mention the Historic Landmarks Commission. They are not just a design review body. They are charged with protecting and listing historic buildings. Under the questions, my comment about the qualifications for an historical experienced architect or similar official, and of course the requests for demolition should go through the Historic Landmarks Commission. It's always possible to have special meetings. The number 5, the preference toward preservation is good, and yes, the proposal to number 6 to stabilize a resource is important. Again, the question mark under 7D says experience with historic resources ? I think it should be required. I was in Eureka at a state preservation conference when the Ferndale earthquake hit, and that was pretty interesting. Lots of aftershocks, and fortunately there were some employees from the State Historic Preservation Office there with their equipment that they just keep in the trunk of their cars. So they went immediately next door to Ferndale and offered to help. Some of the Southern California earthquakes were not so lucky. In some places, buildings were immediately, it seemed, torn down. That was not appropriate. After our 1925 earthquake, apparently the building officials sent out some local engineers and probably visiting engineers to make a list of the conditions of buildings. And that's very interesting to read, because in some cases they said, should be demolished immediately, and that was not happened. That did not happen. It was repaired. So all of those questions arise. I'm here as a local historian and as a member of the Historic Resources Committee of the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation. We own and manage several historic buildings, especially adobes. Thank you.
Thank you. Roy Hawthorne, please.
Roy Hawthorne, former building official, City of Santa Barbara, 1988 through 96. I offered copies of a publication which is referenced in your packet, and that was the outcome of a master's research project post Northridge earthquake, and it specifically looked at the city of Fillmore, old family town. My grandparents were the city manager and justice of the peace there. It's a big topic that you're undertaking. I applaud Jaime and Andrew and George all for taking this on. It's sorely needed. Other communities have done it. This document is commonly referred to in training at statewide levels, and I want all of City Council to have a copy. I've got a copy for the City Attorney also. It really goes into great depth. There's three parts: the political side of it, the techniques, and the regulatory side. My recommendation, given the volume of information, is that City Council establish a blue ribbon panel, as they did in 1984 for the adoption of the unreinforced masonry ordinance for the City of Santa Barbara, which my predecessor began and I completed in 1988 with the adoption of that ordinance. It's many meetings, but it involved representatives of the community, including the building owners, the engineers, the architects, the preservationists, and staff. And they met and deliberated all the implications of adopting an ordinance and how it was going to work and what those manifestations were going to mean in the height of an emergency, which is when everyone's emotions and pocketbooks are impacted. So that's my recommendation. I'm considered, a statewide or even national expert on the topic. This was funded by President Clinton's discretionary funds through the California SHPO. It was vetted by a professional group of editorial panel members that I put together, including the Office of Emergency Services, the structural engineers, the American Institute of Architects, and building officials. So with that,
Question,
Ms. Murillo?
So Mr.
I'm
Harvick,
open to answer any questions you have.
You're suggesting that we form or we develop some kind of community process where more people come and talk about this?
Public participation. I think the Ordinance Committee is wonderfully talented, but this is a big topic.
Thank you. But maybe the Historic Landmarks Commission...
It could be a subcommittee of HLC. It could be like I said, a blue ribbon panel that is farther reaching, because it does impact other departments, including Public Works and Fire and Police.
Well, we'll see what we can do today. So thank you.
Mr. Hofstra has a question.
Have you read what the staff proposed here?
I only got it Sunday night, so I haven't read it in great detail, but I think they're on tap with the right questions, but for example, imposing a requirement for shoring on a private property owner, if there is no ability to pay on the property owner's behalf, then the city needs to look at doing it themselves. And there are federal acts, the Robert T. Stanford Act, which provides funding for public agencies to do work on private property if the hazard actually imposes risk to the public, the general public, i.e. a sidewalk. So in the city of Fillmore, the Fillmore Theater was saved through the city doing the shoring and paying for it, and the federal government paid for it because it was impacting city sidewalk. One other last thing. Imminent threat. It is a term that is actually defined in regulation in the California Historic Building Code. Something that we took on. I'm a member of that board. It's a 21-member board that represents all the stakeholders in buildings, and we maintain that code. And we are an appellate body to any decision involving an imminent threat, too. So if you guys decide there is an imminent threat and someone disagrees, they could come to us for a second opinion. So I wanted to mention that as an aside. There is yet another level of government, but it's actually a good one because our 21-member board, we actually have a potential hearing on 2 buildings in Benicia that have been declared imminent threats right now. And
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harthorne. Appreciate that. Mr. Lavoie, did you have a comment? I know you didn't fill a speaker's lip. I'm going to try to hold you to 2 minutes, too, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm here as staff, I guess. Well, speaking as an historian, most important buildings we know from history, we know as ruins, and a lot of them as earthquake ruins. One of them close by, the stone chapel at San Juan Capistrano, we only know as an earthquake ruin. It collapsed shortly after it was built in an earthquake event. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing is some buildings are more important than others. Not all historic resources are all that important. They're important, but they're not that important. There are some homes that are important. They're not as important as, say, the Mission. The other thing is thinking about that day when the earthquake hits. There's a lot of things that are going to need to be repaired first, or that are going to need the building officials' attention: the bridges, the power, the water. An old building is not going to be on his mind, really. He's going to need help that day. And so I would say, rather than put it all on one person or one small body, that perhaps what we need is a team of qualified engineers involving historians, the building official, his staff, to come together that day and go out through the city and evaluate on a preliminary basis, this building's going to come down all by itself. This building, we can stabilize this building. And on a preliminary basis, make that determination. And then from there, do a set of, and they need guidelines to make determinations, and some of them exist. The other would be to, after that happens, then it's up to someone to make an argument that my building needs to fall down. And to be honest, I don't trust my colleagues when I hear them say I can't afford to do that or this is infeasible. I work for a client. The client pays me. I represent the client very much like a lawyer represents whoever his client is. So I would rely more on what the building official told me than I would even a qualified engineer, architect, or whatever. So some things to keep in mind as we go through this.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you all for your comments. So back to the committee and the questions. I had a couple of kind of general questions about this, and one was, as Mr. Vincent brought up about, tenants and timelines and all that. Some commercial properties are also historical properties, in that there's going to be limits to insurance in terms of time, in terms of what the percentage of building reparations are available, and of course loss of income insurance and different things. So, and I know we're not going to try to set insurance parameters and qualifications, but there's part of me that wonders if in today's ability to digitally record and to assess things, if it wouldn't make more sense to have very detailed and very accurate archival information. And the point that Mr. Lavoie just brought up about a chapel, that there was no real historical record, maybe some artist renderings. But today we could have complete digital and laser line kind of recordings that would give us those things and probably allow us to expedite in the case of a huge event. So I don't know if that was brought into it, but my two questions are, number one, that kind of archival information, if that would be some kind of a substitute for shoring up a building that might be coming down eventually, and or our insurance market possibilities considered as we go through this process as well. What's in the world of reality versus what we want to do historically, and so we don't get into a condemnation procedure, something like what Mr. Hodges might have brought up, where there just aren't the resources to do it. What's out there in the market that will allow that to happen? So, Mr. Lemon, where did we leave off on the questions? Unless anybody has a question outside of that, Ms. Mario?
Thank you. So, our city is unlike any other, right? If we look over, I love our sister city, Goleta, but it doesn't have the historic resources that we have. I think we need to make a decision, first of all, are we going to go for the most historic preservation? What is driving our conversation here? Because if it is, then all of these questions will be colored through that filter. We want to save these buildings if we can. And so that means we would ask for shoring up while the permit was being processed. Or if we're going to say, we're talking about the big earthquake and everything's going to be a total mess and we're just going to give up and start over, I don't think so. So I would like to start the conversation there, that we save as much of the history through these structures that we can.
So you're reading yes on item 6?
And I say that, of course, if some city buildings are falling down and the taxpayers in a disaster are saying, you're going to spend $20 million to save that, or, what about this bridge, what you're saying, Mr. LeBoy, I think there will be a time to make that decision. But to put stringent rules in place now would be the way to go to honor what we have here in the city. So, what about 4, Mr. Lamone? Who makes the determination? It looks like you're asking that question. Building official, civil, or structural engineer? Is that what's your recommendation on that? I'm not ready to.
Well, we do have 6 components in our staff report. And,
okay.
One of the recommendations is that we have a civil or structural engineer involved with that evaluation. So I think it's a combination of all 3. I think there's definitely an interest by the Historic Landmarks Commission, as you know, to hear the building official's opinion on the matter. So I think maybe a both having a say in the matter.
Okay. So you're good with that answer then?
I'm good with saying that all 3, or all 2, a engineering evaluation and a building official evaluation. I don't know if Mr. Stuffler has any different thoughts.
Mr. Chair, Committee Member Murillo, just so you know how the building official works in this situation, when we have these situations. So I don't make all the decisions. I rely on engineers to give me information and tell me what they recommend. I may break a tie if there's a tie, but I'm listening to the design professionals that we have in the community that are experienced with these types of buildings, and I'm going to be asking for a historical, an architect who's familiar with historical restoration, or an engineer that's familiar with historical preservation and restoration, to give me the information that we need to make an intelligent decision. So that's how I operate. That's how we're trained to operate as building officials. We don't just go out and determine which buildings are going to get knocked down and then go home and come back the next day and do it again. We listen to the input that we get from the professionals in the community that we rely on.
And can I say that public safety in this kind of situation would be the most important? We don't want a building falling on top of anyone. So whenever you're making the decision, any building that's under question should be taped off and nobody should be able to go near it. I mean, am I stating something that's obvious, or do we need to make a determination on something like that?
I think the input is good because it reinforces what we do. So there are a number of ways to mitigate hazards. Demolishing a structure is one way. Another way is to cordon off areas around and the fallout area if you think the building's going to fall down. Between the time of identifying that it looks like it's going to fall down or be a hazard and the time you can get it shored, you go out and you barricade out off the streets and you get the neighboring properties vacated. And you do all the steps you could do to mitigate loss of life and minimize the potential loss of property. And then you work very quickly to get the property shored and get an evaluation to determine if it can be shored. So yes, there are options other than demolish and restore. There are intermediate measures we can take to assure public safety and still have a historic resource in place, however much of it is left while we make the decision.
And then waivers of liability would come into play if the neighbor insisted on occupying their building, or if I read in here, if someone wants to go in and retrieve property, right, there's a way to protect the city from being sued.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, that particular point, I'm not sure exactly where that recommendation came from, in the sense of I can understand the desire of property owners and even residents particularly wanting to go back into buildings that have been yellow tagged or red tagged. I certainly wouldn't recommend any approach that would go counter to the findings of the building official or other professionals who have evaluated the safety of the building. There's no piece of property that is more precious than a human life. And so to jeopardize that life for a physical, tangible object, we all have things that are near and dear to us, but at the same time, life is more precious. And so to set up a process where somebody says, if I write my name on a piece of paper and give it to the city will, against its better judgment, let me go into a dangerous building, and gosh forbid something happens to me, I'm going to not hold the city responsible. That's just not the right approach to take. We really ought to be, if you have a situation, make the building safe if you can. Once it's safe, then get your belongings. But to rely on a piece of paper and hope that nobody acts contrary to their commitments on that piece of paper is not the recommendation from the city attorney's office.
Okay, that is in the staff report under number 4 on page 3. So
That's true.
just thank you for your advice on that. So,
Sure. Well, I'd like to clarify. The reason it was included is because some communities allow for it. And I think there's a question of, has the building been shored and braced adequately enough where it is now safe to enter the building? And so there is a judgment call as to whether or not. You'll have, the reason we pose the questions, those questions do come up. And we can prohibit it or we can allow for it. And that's part of the reason why we're bringing it up. If we have clear direction, we'll incorporate those rules into place.
Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you. I agree with Ms. Murillo's premise that our history and our buildings are really important to us, and the fundamental premise ought to be whatever we can do, let's try to do it to preserve them in the event of a real disaster. The second thing I would say, though, is that there's no way we're going to make rules that are going to cover everything. No matter what we do, there's going to be an exception. So somehow in the philosophy that we adopt here ought to be a sense of flexibility, that knowing we cannot foresee the future, allow decisions to be made on all parts as much as possible to adapt to the situation as it arises. Now, that may sound too slippery for you, sir, but I think from just a practical viewpoint, that's the way to go. Because I can't say, oh, absolutely here and absolutely. I can say fundamentally, as Ms. Murillo said, yeah, we want to preserve things, but under that umbrella, I would like to have the operating philosophy, as you kind of said, there are going to be exceptions, and we ought to make judgments, and that, I think, is the right attitude. Am I misstating?
No, Mr. Chair and Committee Member Hotchkiss, you're right in the wheelhouse of what I'm thinking of. All we're going to be able to do in this is create a process. What we're asking you as the Ordinance Committee is to give us some direction on which way to approach that process. so far I've heard from 2 out of the 3 of you that the starting point should be to preserve what we can, and and so the process will tell us what we can. It also get to your point, Committee Member Hotchkiss, that when we get to the end point where the property owner simply says, that's too much, you're asking too much of me through this process, what happens? I went back and I looked at the Preservation Foundation's model ordinance. The way they've structured their model ordinance is that it errs on the side of preserving property. It errs on the side of requiring the property owner to take the preservation actions. And then what it does is it sets up a process where the property owner, if that property owner gets to a point where they say it's just too much for me, they can request an exemption or a waiver. And a decision-making body, the Historic Landmarks Commission or the City Council on Appeal, would make a final action on that waiver. Then if that action is still contrary to the property owner's interest, they could challenge the basis on which, the evidence on which the decision was made. And so they would take a writ and they would say, court, order the city to remove their order to me to restore this building because they ignored the evidence before them at that hearing that justified that it just is too expensive, it is too much of a burden on me. So there would be the escape valve or the release valve to the circumstance that you described of a property owner who just says, I can't handle this.
Right. Okay, thank you. May I continue?
Go ahead.
The one thing I would add is I think the public comments were excellent. Ms. Days, Mr. Lavoie, and Mr. Hartens all. So, and I think you would agree with that. You'll take a look at those. Ms. Days was very specific, Mr. Lavoie broader, and Mr. Hartens, I haven't, he gave us some homework here. I haven't looked at it. I think you should take a look at that too.
But let me go back real quickly because I'm thinking about the big one that Mr. Lavoie was talking about, the big earthquake. And a very recent example, I'm going to do this by chance drawing the ire of some of the folks in the audience, but a great example was preserving the one wall of the California Hotel. An old wall, and the idea was we need to preserve that. Now, had we had very good archival, digital photographs, measurements, and whatever, it may have been more expeditious and, in fact, safer in the long run, let alone cheaper and more easy to build, had we gone that way and allowed the property owner to go through and demolish it. And that wasn't as the result of a disaster. But I'm thinking of that as just a real-time example where somebody could say, you could have this argument back and forth, whether it was an imminent threat or maybe it wasn't determined it was an imminent threat and the property owner still bears the liability of this thing falling down. There's just a lot of ways you would go that you'd say, wow, if we could replace that exact architecture down to the final detail, if we had those good records, wouldn't that be a greater benefit to the community at large? So and that could be a question I'd like to ask one of those guys offline sometime, because to me that might serve the community better than trying to do that monstrous structure we had to put up to save that one wall of the California Hotel for as long as it was up there. So that was just a thought in terms of the archival information. Ms. Murillo.
Mr. Chair, so I'm just watching the clock, but if you agree with Councilmember Hotchkiss and I that we should try to save as much as possible, then maybe we can buzz through the questions before 2.
Let's give it a shot, Mr. Lamone.
Okay, so getting back to question number 6, I think there is support to ask that property owners shore up or stabilize the building. And what I heard also is maybe the qualifications could be expanded to include some preservation architects that have some expertise. So, and we could also leave it to the building official to make that determination. If there's a plan that's required to be prepared, obviously our Historical Landmarks Commission could be involved in that process to evaluate the qualifications of the submittal application. So I think you could direct us in that manner.
Ms. Murillo?
Well, it should be someone with that expertise. So I'm sorry. So are we saying contractor or architect or?
I'm suggesting that it could be a wide range, and it could be based on the building official making a decision. I think there are some homes a contractor are qualified to repair. You don't necessarily. I think it's a question of the quantity of damage with every building.
Mr. Chair, what I would suggest is I'm thinking of two different things. I think one way to draft the ordinance would be, what is your preferred source of information? I'm hearing that you would, if you had a perfect world, you would be looking for a structural engineer or architect with experience in historic preservation. And a nodding of heads would be sufficient. If that's what you're looking for, okay, we'll draft the default provision of the ordinance would be that's who prepares the shoring plan, or that is who has to inform, that's in order to seek a demolition permit, the property owner would need to submit a report from a person with those kinds of qualifications. The reason I say that would be the default provision is I also want to be cognizant and anticipate the circumstances of the totality of a situation following a disaster where we may not have those resources available to us in a timely fashion. And so we would present initially in general a structural engineer or architect with experience in historic resource preservation would be the default or the starting point, and alternatively, in the absence or in an exigent circumstance, a structural engineer or architect without necessarily that experience. And if we feel that we need to go further, and I'll work with Mr. Stuffler and Mr. Lamone, maybe there's a third option in the case that the engineer or architect isn't available, and so that I want to build in that flexibility that you were speaking of, in the sense of responding to the circumstances, not setting up requirements that are untenable or a catch-22 for a property owner trying to go through this process following a disaster, but at the same time that is respectful of what your priorities are, and then allowing for the flexibility in the back.
Right.
Does that sound good, Mr. Lamont?
That sounds acceptable. Well, again, one of the things that I would encourage you to wait and be patient on is we will come back with some language, and you'll have an opportunity to weigh in again on whether or not we're on track with your direction.
Okay.
Next question is, should the city actually authorize to shore up or stabilize the building, and what happens if the owner is unwilling or unable to do so?
So basically, what you're saying there is, if the city steps in and does it and has to and puts a lien on the building, so in essence, if there's a default, it's going to be a taking then.
One of the issues that Mr. Stuffley has raised is his comfort level of actually making a presentation to council when that actually happens. And I believe that was a joint report that you would do when possibly to get authorization to do so.
Committee members, and Mr. Vincent can elaborate on this, but there's already a procedure in the municipal code for damaged buildings, and for us to address those if a property owner doesn't. And in the municipal code and in our maintenance codes, we can come to City Council and make a request for approval for the city to do work on someone else's property. So those systems are already in place, and I think what we're trying to confirm here is we're going to tie those into this ordinance, so that when we have an owner who has no means to do the work that needs to be done, yet the community feels the resource is important to restore and preserve, we'll have a method for moving that forward and having that conversation and seeing what those costs are and making that determination in a public venue.
Yeah, because I would sure want to have a pretty solid legal finding before I thought that would be part of a new ordinance.
So, Mr. Chair, my response is yes on this. That's what we're talking about, right? Going for it. Okay.
Quick question: Who? Let's say this becomes necessary. With what body would that decision rest? City Council?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, in one sense, if the work required budgetary authorization in excess of $35,000, which is Mr. Casey's authority right now, that would have to come to the City Council for appropriation. Okay. So ultimately, there are some, this type of provision would be written in such a way that the city has the authority to do so, but is not required to do so. It would be permissive. So whether ultimately the council delegates some amount of that authority to a city officer to make those decisions initially, or if the city council retains that authority, you wouldn't be required to shore up a building, but you would have the authority within the municipal code to do so, even if it was even if the property owner was reluctant or didn't want it shored up at that moment. You could do so in order to buy time for a more calculated decision-making process regarding whether the resource should be demolished or not.
Okay, so let's go with this.
Okay, are those decisions appealable to council, by the way?
We can create, if you want these things appealable to council.
I don't know that I do. I'm just kind of curious.
Sure.
I mean,
we can, anytime the council wants to have something appealable to it, it can ultimately come to the city council. City council would be the final appellate body within the city. We could make portions or all of this subject to simply the Historic Landmarks Commission. I don't see that being the end result, but I could see where some of these decisions might have a final action at a lower body and not necessarily come to city council.
Well, I just think we want to look out for the greater historic good of the community, but by the same time preserving private property rights as much as we possibly can and getting the best of both worlds.
So are you suggesting that we add that, Mr. Chair, to this item? That if the property owner disagrees, they can appeal to the city council?
No, I think that's out of my pay grade to suggest. I think that's a legal remedy.
What Mr. Stuffler was talking about before, currently in the code we have Chapter 2209, partially demolished buildings. I am watching the clock. That deals with the circumstance where you have a partially demolished building that's presenting a hazard or a nuisance to the community. That actually gives the city the authority to enter into a process where the city ultimately demolishes the building to remove that nuisance or hazard and then puts a lien on the property. This is kind of the converse. This would be the converse where the property owner is either unwilling or unable to do the shoring because their end game is to get to a demolition. The property owner has already decided, I want to move on to a different phase of this property's life. And the city is saying, hold on for a second, shore up your building for a period of time so we can make a decision, and he still says no. And so in this case, this would give the city the authority to do the shoring itself and charge that as a lien to the property owner if the city wished to go through that. Doesn't necessarily mean that building will ultimately be restored, but it means that it buys both the property owner and the community the time to consider it. That's the question before you.
And I'm going to suggest to the committee and the staff that we go to we do number 9 and then we continue the other questions if we may, because we're just not going to get. I mean, Mr. Hotchkiss just said we want to get this right. We don't want to just blast through and try to present some answers to council. If that's a pleasure of the committee.
No, that's.
Sure, if you think we can't finish in 10, 15 minutes.
I really don't. And I think somebody else wants to make a presentation from.
Well, that's
a different thing. Okay. Yeah, let's go. I mean, 9, I can support that.
Yes, that's a yes. For me, yeah.
Yeah, I can support that. We can just try to keep moving on until we get to a quarter of and see where we're at here.
10 has to do with submittal requirements, and we outlined the type of expectation that we would have for those requirements. And I think we heard earlier that there is a desire to have experience with these persons to do this type of damage assessment, so we'll incorporate that direction. And again, I think this is standard. We just wanted to confirm that we have this expectation to prepare these cost estimates so we can make a decision with respect to economic hardship.
Okay, I agree. You should ask for all of those things.
Okay,
right?
And the F is the question. Last one is, the plan is not preservation sensitive. Should the property owner be required to submit a second opinion from a professional? that is something that some communities require.
I think if all parties are in concert, why would you require that somebody get a second opinion?
So, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, this would be in the context of the applicant is now before the Historic Landmarks Commission with a demolition application, and the Historic Landmarks Commission is generally of the mind that the building is capable of being restored. The applicant has, as part of these the required submittals, submitted at least one plan from a qualified structural engineer, presumably with historic architectural experience or historic preservation experience, and and the recommendation of that professional is for the demolition or for something that is less than a restoration. The question here is, should he be required to go out and find two professionals who concur with that idea as opposed to simply one? It's essentially a peer review. It's requiring the property owner to get a peer review of that paid-for professional's recommendation that just happens to be in concert with the person who is paying them.
Then the answer is yes, if we want to preserve our buildings. So.
Who pays for this second?
He does.
This proposal would be application submittal requirements.
Okay.
So the applicant would be paying for these to prepare these reports.
Okay, well, if I'm being cynical, I can't imagine that the second opinion would be any different than the first if that's the same guy's paying for it.
Yeah.
I don't see that.
I mean, that's
part.
how dispute resolutions are done like that in the private sector.
Yeah.
You get two parties that agree on a third, and they do it.
The other thing I would add to all this is the sort of a blanket clause that would say, for instance, you had some specific things in the last slide that they were supposed to submit, and we could just add to that, and any other material that they felt relevant. Who knows what? Doesn't really change things.
I do want to add that you could settle on the fact that you apply this standard to the city landmarks. Those are the most highly preserved structures. As Mr. Lavoie indicated, there is a ranking of significance, and applying a higher threshold for city landmarks might be the compromise. And Mr. Buell also mentioned to me that we could also contract out, the city can contract and therefore get that impartial opinion, not have the owner get the peer review, have the city contract out and get a separate review as a process.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Mr. Chair, I like that compromise, but Mr. Lamone, was it you that put this question on there? And why did you do that?
I think it was working with our city attorney who listened to both planning staff and the building official and tried to understand the types of questions that would come up when there is a conflict of opinion. As you know, the Historic Landmarks Commission can disagree with a conclusion. And this is a method to exhaust all types of information to add to the record. So there's we don't want to regret that the building was demolished without another person's second eyes on it and to see if that was the only solution.
So let me move that we apply the second opinion provision to city designated landmarks only.
Paid by.
And I saw Ms. Days nodding her head, so I think she likes that idea.
But this is going to be financed to ensure independence. Financed by the city, correct?
Right, and
well, that's an option. You could make it that the city contracts that second opinion out to make it more
confident.
Yeah,
I'll add that to my motion.
Yeah, that would make more sense.
I'll second that.
Next question: should it check in with? Well, that's the question we were asking. Should these decisions become to city council? And I believe we were indicating that there might be some authorization that it wouldn't be necessary. In other words, if a demolition occurs, does council want to know about it?
Yes.
Mr. Vincent.
Oh, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, the question I would ask is, do you want the decision for approving the demolition coming to the city council, or do you simply want to be made aware of the demolition approvals that the Historic Landmarks Commission has granted?
I think we should wear the mantle of responsibility. It should come to us as a decision.
It may come to you as a result of an appeal.
Yeah.
But in some cases, there may be a direction that the property owner wants to have council weigh in on the order to demolish.
Yeah, and I'm going to say that coming to council for a decision as a requirement could put an unfair time burden on the project, especially given the circumstances under which these things might come into play. That may not be something that we want to go building by building by building and sit here for weeks and weeks at a time doing each demolition project. I mean, like I said, I'm just once again going back to Mr. Lavoie and his disaster scenario. I think it's exactly how we should think about this.
And as you say, it could come to the council on appeal.
Right.
So it isn't automatically before the council, but optionally. That makes more sense to me.
Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
So what you're saying is that the Historic Landmarks Commission would be the final decision maker unless there's an appeal. Is that what I'm hearing?
Unless there's an imminent threat hazard that the building official can take in a more of an immediate demolition, I believe that you have an ability to do that.
Well, I would be outvoted if the other two are thinking the way they are, so that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, should the ordinance authorize fee waivers to encourage repair and restoration that is preservation sensitive? That's some of the aspects of allowing people to move forward and not be worried about fees when it comes to repairing and restoration.
We like fees.
I would support a waiver.
But in the context of saving buildings, waive the fee, right?
You could also apply it just to private homes if there were some type of. Where do you think is the angst involved with repairs?
Once again, Mr. Lamona, I mean, I am completely in favor of waiving the fee to expedite this, but does that create two classes of a citizen then? And once again, the big disaster hits.
Not necessarily, Councilor Rouse. There are other communities that offer fee reductions and fee waivers for historic properties.
Okay.
It's not unheard of.
Those
so
are
the
precedents.
question is that do you want to have some type of recovery of the costs associated with all the decisions that are being made?
What's your thought?
So instead of saying should we say could the ordinance authorize? In other words, it's an option here.
Well, I think we'd like to know specifically if we should write some provision for it into the ordinance draft.
Well, in a time of disaster, you want to help people as much as you can.
I know as a point of order, just to reflect on what happened after the T-fire, there was a reduction of applications, submittals, costs for those T-fire victims. As a point of order, that we actually expedited the process and reduced the fees.
And those weren't necessarily historic structures, so.
No, that was the council decision.
If nothing else, people will feel, rightly so, that we're trying to help them out in times of duress.
I agree.
Okay, so 13, we're saying yes, waive the fee.
Yes.
Okay.
And involving potential penalties, should we address that? The possibility that there will be some violations, people doing things without permit, and should we incorporate that for the severe violation of demolition without permit? Some communities have prohibited redevelopment for certain years.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, in the interest of time, I think, yes, we're going to want to have penalties because penalties in the reverse create incentives to act in the way we want them to. We'll research more. The only reason I'm short-circuiting the discussion right now is that some of these provisions have a lot of consideration that it would take some more time than we have to have a reasoned discussion about some of these penalties, particularly things about prohibiting redevelopment for a period of time. That's much more burdensome than almost anything you're considering today, or substantial financial penalties. We'll come back with more information at a future date on those types of provisions.
Just real quick, so what you're worried about is, so in a disaster, something is sort of damaged and then someone will just come and knock it down, that's the penalty, that's the bad act that you're anticipating?
That's the idea, that people know that there's ramifications so they don't proceed and they don't misinterpret these placards as a way to justify that they've moved forward because they've abated a situation.
And then there is a way that if there's a discussion about penalties and there's something that's forgivable, we can do that, right? Or
well, a penalty is a penalty. I think
okay.
There are situations where maybe it might not be justified if they're unaware of the requirement.
But what Mr. Vincent is suggesting is that you come back
Yes.
with a different or a fleshed out discussion about penalties or suggestions for us.
Right.
Okay.
And on this one, I mean, $10,000 a day is pretty serious. How about if you said up to $10,000 a day?
Which you're coming back with that.
We'll come back with some options for you.
Okay, and speaking of which, Ms. Lamone, so are you going to make the findings based on our comments and whatnot? Because I was thinking about reporting out to the council just not too long from now. I don't know if I want to go down line item by line item, or what is the proper protocol, Mr. Minson?
Mr. Chair, I'd say, I don't expect you to try to remember off the top of your head line by line today. You feel free with your notes. I would say that I would just simply advise the council that we've considered the topic of preservation of historic resources following a disaster, covered a lot of ground on topics. In general, the committee seemed to favor preservation when in more cases than not. And that staff will be coming back with more specific recommendations to the committee in the future.
Very good. Thank you very much. And I want to really thank the speakers once again for helping out and being involved with this. We're adjourned.